Where the Light Waits. Tonight's story takes place in a small New England harbor town, where the tides move slow and the years move faster. It's about late beginnings, stubborn pride, and the ordinary courage of showing up. If you've ever wondered whether a quieter life can still hold big truths, this one's for you. Part 1. Low Tide, Late Season. By the time tourists had stopped buying seashell soap and lighthouse magnets, the town seemed to breathe again. In September, the harbor lost its glitter and gained its shape. Boats sat honest in their slips. Gulls shouted only to themselves. At the edge of the old cannery, Nora Gray's thrift shop, Second Chances, leaned into the ocean wind as if listening for news. Nora was 58, the kind of woman who smiled with half her face and saved the other half for thinking. She'd been a school secretary once, then a caregiver, then a widow, and now she sold other people's useful leftovers. Flannel shirts, casserole dishes, a trumpet with a dent that looked like a kiss. She liked the way an object remembered what folks tried to forget. The morning the notice went up, Nora was sorting a box of mismatched mugs donated by a vacation rental company. A white paper was taped to the cannery door. Redevelopment to commence in March. The landlord promised a modern, multi-use experience with harbor-forward cuisine. She read it twice and imagined her little shop floating out to sea on a raft of teacups. "You see that?" said a voice behind her. Walt Bishop, 63, stood with his hands in the pockets of a jacket that had known better days and made peace with worse. Walt had been a lineman for 30 years and looked like a man who could carry a ladder with one hand, which he had and still did when anyone asked. He rented a slip for his skiff and came by sometimes to bring her a broken lamp that wanted to be a lamp again. "I saw it," Nora said. "They'll put in cedar planters," Walt said as if this were a diagnosis. "Good for photographs, bad for knees. Tourists will admire them for a summer. Come winter, the cedar will crack." "You should write for them," Nora said. "Can't," he answered. "I used up all my good words on directions and apologies." They went inside. Sunlight stepped in with them, laid itself down on the racks. A bell on a blue ribbon marked the opening of the door. When customers came, the bell behaved. When the wind came, it made its own rules. A man was already poking at fishing sweaters as if they might bite. Mrs. Delaney from the library held up a platter with chipped roses. "For the Friends of the Library bake sale," she said. "Cakes look kinder on old china." $3, Nora said. "2," said Mrs. Delaney. $2.50, Nora answered. Mrs. Delaney smiled, and the platter bent its dignity toward a paper bag. After lunch, Walt knelt on the wooden floor and untangled a nest of extension cords, as if bad knots were a personal insult. "There's a right way," he said, "and a coward's way." He wound the cords carefully. Nora watched his hands. Men's hands do their most honest talking when they think no one is listening. "Are you thinking of moving the shop?" he asked. "I was thinking of moving the cannery," she said. "Put it on rollers and nudge it down the road, past the fancy ideas." They both smiled at a future already occupied by other futures. In the afternoon, smoke from wildfires far away reached them as a faint foreign smell. New England took it politely, as New England takes distant trouble. The sky grew the color of old linen. Cars drove by as if driving into a memory. A boy with a skateboard asked if the blue milk crate in the window was for sale. "Everything is," Nora said, and the boy nodded as if he'd learned a general rule. Toward closing, Nora's daughter called. Leela lived outside Chicago, where the streets were wide and the houses wore porches like a uniform. "You saw the notice?" Lila said. "I saw it in the paper. The developers make those places, you know." "I know," Nora said. "You could come here for a while," Lila offered carefully as if laying a fragile dish on a table that might not hold it. "We've got the basement fixed up. You'd like the neighborhood. People walk their dogs like it's a job with good benefits." "I'm not a basement person," Nora said more gently than it sounded. "I'm a light from the side person." Lila was quiet. Nora loved her for trying and for not insisting. "Okay," Lila said. "Okay, Mom." After she hung up, Nora stood at the doorway. Walt locked the back room, checked the gurgling dehumidifier, and turned the sign to closed, though the door was still open. A gull flapped past at eye level as if surprised to find them there. "Want chowder at May's?" he said, as though the decision would be temporary but the consequences might not be. "Let me get my sweater," she said, and then didn't. The night wasn't cold enough yet, and some things ought to be borne. As they walked, the harbor's water took on the uncomplaining gray of people who have long memories and limited means. A man stood near the pier, telling his phone how the fish had gotten scarce. "They were never ours," he said into the air. "We only borrowed them." The smoke smell thinned. The news on the radio in May's diner would say the wind had shifted. At the diner counter, Walt stirred his chowder to make it cool faster. Nora didn't stir hers. The steam rose with patience. "I could find you a place," Walt said. "For the shop, I mean. There's that old auto parts store on Broad. It's ugly in a way a person could argue with." "I'll look," she said. "I'll look with both eyes." "Good," he said. On the way home, the town's lights flickered once, a memory of storms. People looked up from television sets and then down again, as if reminded of something they hadn't exactly forgotten. Nora paused outside the cannery. The notice on the door held its white breath. She touched it with the back of her fingers, the way you test a cake to see if it's done. It was not done. It would not be done for months. Time, like the tide, announced itself and then took its time arriving. That night, in her apartment over the shop, Nora lay in a bed that creaked once to greet her. Outside the harbor was the sound of a page turning. She thought, without permission, of Walt winding orange cords into obedience. She thought of Lila's generous basement, of cedar planters made for photographs, and of sweaters with the smell of other kitchens stored in their sleeves. The last thing she knew before sleep was that certain problems, like certain songs, are pitchy up close and truer at a distance. Part 2. The Right Kind of Ordinary. It turned out the auto parts store on Broad had a cracked window and a view of a gas station, which counted in certain weathers as scenery. The concrete floor carried the ghost of oil stains the way old letters carry perfume. The landlord was the mayor's cousin and spoke as if to a room full of people who weren't there. "High ceilings," Walt said, pointing up. "Harsh lights," Nora said, pointing across. "We can fix lights," Walt said, and the future tilted slightly to agree. They stood there imagining the space full of other people's stories. Coats that had learned the shape of grief and cheer, casserole dishes that had known children's picky years, a piano bench whose secret was that it knew every hymn. Nora felt a prickle at the base of her neck, the kind of hope that blushes late in life and is embarrassed to be seen. "Tell him we'll take it," Walt said. "You're not moving in with me," she said, and he laughed, which was what she wanted. They signed nothing. The cousin said paperwork was a formality that honored fear. They left with a handshake and a receipt for a deposit, which was, in its way, a promise. At May's, the world was the same as it always pretended to be. A Red Sox cap kept a man's hairline company. A woman at a corner table read a book and stirred her tea with the absent accuracy of habit. May herself, square of shoulder and generous of cheek, walked from coffee machine to counter with a gait that said she had time and did not intend to waste it. "You two look like you're hiding news in your pockets," May said, pouring coffee that had been brewed to the exact point between honest and mean. "New place for the shop," Nora said. May nodded, approving the direction of the sentence. "Good. The tourists don't need another restaurant where the scallops wear microgreens like a hat they can't afford." She wiped a small circle of counter she had wiped already and went to scold the grill for misunderstanding bacon. Nora called Lila to tell her, and her daughter said, after a pause that was not disapproval, "I worry about your back." "I've made peace with it," Nora said. "It knows my intentions." "That's not how backs work," Lila said, but she was smiling. Nora could hear a smile over 1,000 miles. Around then, Mr. Cho began to stop by the shop again. He was 76 and had a garden that grew tomatoes with serious expressions. In summer, he sold a few to maize. In winter, he arranged seed packets on the kitchen table and let them practice being crops. He looked at everything as if it might teach him a good joke. "The new building," he said, nodding at Broad Street as if it were a person he'd been introduced to. "Ugly, like a hard-working dog. Good." He put down a bag of wire hangers he'd untangled during a movie he hadn't liked. "How much for the salmon sweater today? Asking for a friend who is me." "For you," Nora said, $5. He counted out 4 singles and 2 quarters and then added another quarter for luck. "Luck," he said, returning the extra quarter to the jar, "is a habit." That week, Walt's son, Danny, phoned from somewhere modern. Portland, Oregon, or maybe it was Seattle. The country moved these cities around when you weren't paying attention. They hadn't spoken much in a while, the way men sometimes keep their love folded neatly in a drawer they forget to open. "Hey," Danny said. "Hey," Walt said. "How's the boat?" "The same," Walt said. "Better than me." Danny laughed as if he'd been permitted. "Work's busy," he offered, which is what men say when they mean, "I don't know how to help." "Yeah," Walt said. There was more silence than words, but it did not feel unfriendly. It felt like a road between towns that hadn't seen each other lately. "Come out here sometime," Danny said lightly, as if handing his father a coat. "Okay," Walt said, and neither of them put anything on. That Friday, a storm wandered in from places people moved to when they were tired of thinking about winter. The sky darkened at noon, and the wind told trash cans to consider their options. By evening, the power took a break. The town met itself again in candlelight. Nora, in her apartment upstairs, waited for the refrigerator to remember its duties. She listened to the building sigh and the harbor rearrange itself. A neighbor knocked, a young couple with a baby that had not yet learned patience. "Do you have a flashlight?" they asked. "Ours is an app." "I have the stubborn kind," Nora said, and handed them the heavy yellow light that linemen trust and poets resent. On Broad, the gas station's dark sign looked like a chalkboard. Walt walked the length of his street carrying a headlamp and a coil of common sense. At Mr. Cho's, the tomatoes, each wrapped in newspaper like a sleeper, lay on the table as if waiting for a story. "You good?" Walt asked. "It's only a rehearsal," Mr. Cho said. "The real play is tomorrow." He offered Walt a jar of pickles and the kind of gratitude men allow themselves. Practical, quiet, precise. Back at Second Chances, the bell on the blue ribbon rang to no one's purpose. A draft wandered through and folded a magazine page for later. When the lights returned with a shrug, Nora stood still for a minute as if she'd been witness doing something private. She plugged in the dehumidifier and apologized for doubting it. The next morning smelled like washed dishes. People smiled at one another with the camaraderie of small survival. May's griddle spoke in the language of bacon. Even the gulls were modest for an hour. Late in the day, Lila texted, "Proud of you, Mom." She added a heart because children think hearts are a language older people need translations for. Nora smiled and wrote back, "Me too." Then she wondered if that had sounded like bragging and sent a second text. By you, I mean you. Lila replied with 3 laughing faces and a photo of a sky going on about itself over Illinois. That night, Nora dreamed she was younger than her daughter and consoling her for something neither of them could name. In the morning, the mirror showed her a woman who would not be younger again and did not need consoling. She put on her blue sweater, the one whose elbows apologized for being so human, and went downstairs to count the mugs and open the door to the weather. If you ask how love begins, you'll be handed 1,000 correct answers. In certain towns, it begins with 2 people agreeing, without words, to look at the same ordinary thing and call it good. Part 3. What the Wind Knows. The Broad Street space proved temperamental. The back door stuck in damp weather and boasted about it when dry. A corner of the ceiling dropped a modest flake now and then, like a gentleman aging in public. But light came in from the high windows with the sober kindness of nurses, and the floor held. Walt showed up with shelves he'd built from planks that once were a deck. "They remember sunsets," he said, setting them against the wall. He used a level like a man who believed the world could be corrected if you were patient with it. They worked without talking about working. There is a grammar to shared labor. The half step out of the other person's way, the small cough that signals a screw has dropped, the pause that allows the story you didn't know you were telling to catch up. Around noon, a boy came in with a trumpet case. "Granddad's," he said. "It doesn't like me." Nora opened the latches, felt the breath of an old parade. "We can give it another chance," she said. "How much?" the boy asked. "We'll put it on consignment," she answered, and explained gently how the world makes certain bargains. The boy nodded, relieved to have company in his confusion. When he left, Walt said, "I played clarinet in 10th grade." "Do you still?" "No," he said. "But when I smell varnish, I remember which parts of life can be assembled." They were not in love. They would have rejected the accusation on principle. But there was the way Walt fetched coffee and brought back the exact amount of sugar without being told, and the way Nora found herself saving certain stories for when he'd be there to hear them. One afternoon, Mr. Cho didn't appear, which was interesting because he had said he would. Walt went by his place and returned with news stamped on his face. "Fell in the garden," he said. "I took him to urgent care. They're keeping him overnight. He told me to tell his tomatoes to hold their ground." Nora closed the shop 2 hours early with a sign that apologized sincerely. At the clinic, Mr. Cho lay in a bed under a blanket patterned with small blue diamonds, as if order were a medicine. He wore that certain expression of the recently inconvenienced. "It's nothing," he said. "A rehearsal. Tomorrow is the play." The doctor, who looked as if he had just graduated from being a student of something else, said there might be a small stroke, or there might not. "We'll watch," he said, believing in the usefulness of watching. He spoke gently, as if sharing the joke that no one knows anything for sure. "Do you want me to call your daughter?" Nora asked. Mr. Cho's daughter lived 2 towns over and visited with casseroles that suggested love and the suspicion that her father was not always eating like someone who intends to stay a while. "Call," he said, "but tell her I already ate patience." Nora called, and the daughter came, brisk and careful. She thanked them the way people thank the weather when it cooperates. Walt stood in the hall with his hands in his pockets and looked at the vending machine as if it might reveal a principle. They left after an hour. Outside, evening had already begun its quiet rehearsal. A breeze pushed the flag on the lawn into a slow wave. The air smelled like wet stone and hospital flowers. Walt cleared his throat. "I could check on the garden," he said. "We both could," Nora answered. They walked the 2 blocks to the small house where Mr. Cho had arranged his life like a drawer of carefully folded shirts. In the garden, tomatoes hung with the solemnity of judges. Walt watered with a thrift that suggested he had listened to plants before. Nora pinched basil, because some kindnesses are small and smell good. On the way back, they passed a house with a porch light on, though the sun hadn't fully left yet. The light didn't need to be on. That wasn't the point. Someone was saying, "We're home. Come if you're coming." The gesture traveled further than the beam. At May's, the evening customers were working at their suppers like miners with a fair wage. An old game show asked questions no one at the counter wanted to answer in public. May brought them bowls of fish stew with bread that remembered heat. "How's Cho?" she asked, using his name as if they were all deputized. "Cantankerous," Walt said, which was a healthy sign. "Good," May said. "I'll send something that doesn't taste like hospital." She looked at Walt. "You look tired in the moral way." "He fell," Walt said, and the explanation did the rest. May nodded. "I'll box you pies." They carried the pies like a treaty. At the corner, the streetlight blinked and recovered. A dog barked once, not at anything in particular. In the Broad Street window, the shelves held their pose. "We'll open in 3 weeks," Nora said, as if saying it out loud made a contract with the future. "2," Walt said, just to tempt the gods into benevolence. They stood a minute too long, a habit they were learning together. People drove by without wondering at the sight. A man and a woman outside a store that was not yet itself, taking inventory of the ways a life can still be adjusted. There are loves that arrive like sirens, and there are loves that arrive like a weather report you only half believe until it rains. The second kind is easier to overlook and harder to undo. Part 4. Opening Day, Half Light. The day they opened, a fog rolled in from the ocean and then decided to stay until it had been properly noticed. Broad Street took on the glamour of a photograph found in a drawer. Everything true and slightly distant. Nora had arranged a display of iron skillets and paperback novels, as if to say that one feeds the body and the other finishes the job. Walt had hung a sign he'd carved from a smooth board. Second chances, useful things, kind prices. When he stepped back, the E in chances tilted its head like a curious bird. "Leave it," Nora said. "People trust a little tilt. Customers came the way small rivers begin. A trickle pretending it isn't a promise." Mrs. Delaney from the library bought the battered Scrabble set because the tiles felt good in the hand. A man starting over after a divorce bought 2 plates and a frying pan, and Nora added a wooden spoon and said, "Welcome back." Teenagers tried on old prom dresses and saw themselves as characters whose lives were not yet predictable. A tourist wandered in, looked at a lobster trap buoy as if it were a modern sculpture, and paid for it accordingly. Midday, Mr. Cho arrived, walking with the caution of a man who'd been reminded of physics. His daughter came along, watchful and proud. "I told you," he said, tapping the counter with his coin purse. "A rehearsal." He bought a faded baseball cap because he liked the honesty of its gray. He touched the shelves and said to Walt, "Straight like a promise." They ate sandwiches behind the curtain that pretended to be a wall. May had sent a note with the food. "Don't forget to eat. People forget when they mean well." Nora kept the note. She did not keep notes, as a rule. In the afternoon, Lila called and asked how the day had gone, and Nora told her and did not tell her everything. "I'll visit next month," Lila said. "I want to see it with my eyes." Nora said she'd like that and meant it twice. When the last customer left, Nora and Walt sat on the front steps. The fog had thinned into a mood. Across the street, the gas station sign reported the price of hope, which had gone up. A bicycle clicked past at the speed of a memory. They didn't need to speak, which is a kind of speaking. "I was married 24 years, Walt said finally. "We were more or less decent at it. Then we were more or less decent at being done." "How long?" Nora asked. 8 years. "Me," she said, 7. "Do you miss it?" "Some days," she said. "Mostly I miss the part where you already know each other's grocery list." He nodded. "I don't miss the part where you argue about gutters in August." She laughed. "You find something to argue about if you're stubborn and fortunate." They were quiet again, collecting small pieces of truth like children pocketing smooth stones. Truth is heavy if you take the big chunks. The smaller pieces distribute themselves. "Joe scared me," Walt said. "You think you've agreed with the world about how long things last, and then the world corrects you." "He'll be okay," Nora said, and believed it the way people believe in spring during February because it is necessary to. That evening, as they counted the day's small money and the day's large satisfaction, the notice on the cannery door came back to mind. March was no longer a season, but an appointment. "We did it," Nora said, almost surprised she hadn't consulted anyone about doing it. "You did it," Walt said. "You," she said, "made straight shelves." "Straight-ish," he said, and they let that be the last word. They closed at 6 and for once didn't go to May's. They went to the pier instead. The water wore its bruises softly. A car radio far away played a song that had outlived its irony. A couple argued gently about whether to stay another night. The gulls had gone off shift. "I used to think," Nora said, "that all the important things would have happened by now." "And?" Walt said, "and apparently not." "I'm glad," Walt said, as if gladness were an argument he'd finally chosen to join. They walked to the end of the pier and stood, as many have, at the precise border where land runs out of nouns and lets water finish the sentence. The town behind them kept doing the small chores that keep a town intact, turning on lamps, checking locks, deciding against that last cookie. In a window, a TV explained bad news to people who had paid their bills. "Want to get dinner tomorrow?" Walt asked, and then, because men his age respect the work of clarity, added, "A proper one." "Yes," Nora said, adjusting nothing in herself to make room for the yes. It had always been there. It only needed calling by name. Part 5. Afterglow. The rest, as the saying goes, was both more and less dramatic than it deserved to be. They had dinner at a place down the coast where the napkins were cloth but had forgiven themselves for it. They drove back listening to traffic the way you listen to someone else's grief, respectfully, at a distance. Nora slept better and woke earlier. Walt told fewer stories about weather on ladders and more about what he cooked for himself when no one was looking. Mr. Cho returned to the garden as to a familiar chessboard. Winter knocked, came in without waiting, and took its boots off in the kitchen. The shop's bell learned the weight of coats. People bought books with more pages and sweaters with thicker stories. A teacher came for mugs she didn't need because each one reminded her of a child who had turned out surprisingly. A man who'd sworn off music after a long year bought a radio that caught the oldies station even on cloudy days. Nora watched them leave with their small rescues. She thought, "We keep one another from drowning, not with ropes, but with casseroles and better lamps." Lila visited in January, stepping into the shop in a hat that confessed Illinois winters. She and Walt shook hands, appraised one another with the honest curiosity of people who loved the same person in different ways, and decided to be friends. At May's, Lila said, "I see why you stayed." She took pictures and sent them to friends who proved the existence of the ocean to each other every few months. In February, the developers at the cannery hosted a meeting with maps. The maps were handsome and behaved well under fluorescent lights. There would be cedar planters and a performance space where, the brochure suggested, local artists would perform responsibly. Nora did not speak. She listened. A fisherman asked a question about loading docks that could not be answered by adjectives. A woman in a blazer spoke of activation, and the harbor, listening, declined to be activated. Outside after the meeting, Walt said, "They aren't bad people." "No," Nora said, "they are people with a different definition of enough." The cannery closed, and construction began. The town became a place where traffic cones held long conversations. Dust placed a hand on everything and apologized later. Broad Street, ugly like a hard-working dog, grew a little bossy with life. Second Chances learned the names of people who would never love it and the names of those who couldn't imagine the town without it. In March, on a day whose sun acted like a coupon, Nora stood at the window and thought of her husband without sadness. It had taken 7 years to get this far. She did not measure the distance. She simply recognized the weather. Walt arrived carrying a box marked Kitchen, and within it a lamp that had failed elsewhere but decided to try again here. "Supper," he said. "Always," she answered. They drove past the cannery, which had become less itself, and the pier, which never failed at being itself. At the end of Middle Street, an old maple stood with the expression of someone who had seen everything and agreed to keep living anyway. Walt parked under it as if for protection. At May's, the special was meatloaf done the honorable way. Mr. Cho was at a table with his daughter, dividing a slice of pie with the calculus of affection. The TV promised storms upstate and then promised to be wrong. Walt touched Nora's wrist, not for emphasis but for confirmation. You could miss the gesture unless it was meant for you. "Do you ever regret not leaving?" she asked him, and meant not only this town. "I left," he said, "then I returned until it counted." Outside, the evening lifted itself the way an old dog stands and does not complain. A porch light clicked on sooner than necessary. Nora thought of how many times she'd said no because the world had not yet offered her a better way to say yes. Walt thought of all the wires he'd climbed toward and how many houses he had returned to brightness. The work had been dangerous and particular. This was too. They drove to the Broad Street shop and carried in the box marked "Kitchen," which had no kitchen in it, and the lamp, which would be a lamp again if given mercy. They didn't speak because they were speaking. On the counter, the note from May about eating had a coffee stain and had, therefore, become sacred. Later, they walked to the water. A cold wind came off the harbor and said what cold winds always say. Remember coats. Remember each other. Remember that the body keeps score and sometimes forgives. Walt stood there without his cap, as if arguments with weather still amused him. Nora put her hand through the crook of his arm and felt how much a life could weigh and how gently it could be carried if both people agreed. If you are waiting for a proposal, you have misread the town. If you are waiting for an argument, you have misread the weather. What happened was smaller and more consequential. They went home to their separate places, because habits are not broken all at once. Nora climbed the stairs to her bed that creaked once. Walt rinsed the coffee pot carefully like a confession. Mr. Cho watered the basil and told it, in Korean, gossip that plants understand. In the morning, the town did what towns do when they intend to keep existing. It rose without ceremony and went to work. The harbor moved as if it had never considered another job. The gas station sign yawned and changed its numbers. A child learned to tie a shoe under stubborn instructions. A man, far away in Oregon or possibly Seattle, thought about calling his father and then did. At second chances, the bell on the blue ribbon announced a new day with its faithful impertinence. Nora lifted the shade on the front window. The light came in the way it always does, casual, exact, forgiving. She stood in it, prepared to sell other people's recoveries, prepared to purchase her own. When Walt came in with 2 coffees, she did not say anything grand or foolish. She moved a little to the side so the light could include him. In towns like this, the light waits. It is patient as a decent joke, durable as a cast-iron pan, accurate as a well-tied knot. The trick is to stand where it reaches, and to stay. If this story found you tonight, if it reminded you of a place you loved, or a person you still carry, tap the like button so more folks can stumble upon it. Share a memory in the comments. The shop you miss, the neighbor who saved your day, the meal that tasted like home. And if quiet, human stories are your kind of company, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I'll be here next week with another tale. Thanks for listening.